Hello and welcome to the show. This is Addis Dialogue from Ethiopian Broadcasting Corporation. Ethiopia is among countries of ancient civilization. We can take the Axumite Empire, the coins of Ezana, and the port of Adulis, which Ethiopia has close relations in terms of commerce and trade. And also the Axumite Empire flourishes, particularly in trading with the ancient Roman and Indians through the port of Adulis, Zeila, and Red Sea, implies that Ethiopia has direct access to sea outlet. Ethiopia is the most populous country, yet landlocked. The national trauma that Ethiopia has direct access to sea outlet needs strategic urgency. My guest for today is Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at West Texas A&M University in the United States. His area of specialization is development, state building, and conflict resolution in Red Sea and Nile Basin countries. I'm your host, Gzacho Darib. Do stay with us. Dr. Caleb Demerew, welcome to Addis Dialogue.
Thank you for having me.
Ethiopia is among ancient civilization and the country with ancient civilization, which dates back to BC's, not AD's as well, equating Ethiopia with that of the Babylonians, the Romans, the Persians as well, and the Chinese civilization. What is Ethiopia for you in terms of such ancient civilized state?
I think Ethiopia represents an interesting exception in the study of the modern system of states. It is one of very few states in the international system that are increasingly now referred to as a civilizational state, along with some of these other countries that you've mentioned, right? That can sort of trace some sort of continuity of political culture and statecraft back to the times of antiquity. There's not a lot of states in the international system that can claim that. Certainly China can to some extent, India can to some extent. The transition from Persia to Iran allows Iran to claim that continuity to some extent. In the African continent, you have the Egyptians and the Ethiopians. And so when considering these states, I think a lot of scholars in political science have come to add certain historical variables to help them understand what statecraft looks like, what foreign policy looks like, what state building looks like in the modern day, given that these countries have a lot of civilizational history to which they can trace not perfect, but some sort of continuity. So this is sort of the scope of foreign relations studies in which we place Ethiopia, the idea of a civilizational state.
How do you see the Zen Ethiopia equating itself and having trade and commerce relations with the ancient Roman, even the Arabian Peninsula through Red Sea, port of Adulis and Zeila? How do you see the Zen Ethiopia, not in a contemporary form?
The Ethiopian civilization and its predecessor, the Axumite civilization, had long-standing links with other great powers in the international system of the times of antiquity. And as you mentioned, this dates back to the times before Christ. If you look at the predecessor to the Ethiopian Empire, Aksum itself, Aksum established itself towards the beginning or towards the 1st century before Christ, and it really reached its peak. It was cited as being one of the 4 greatest civilizations on the face of the earth at the time, paralleling the might and the reach, as you mentioned, of the Roman Empire. And what allowed Aksum to really reach its peak was its dominance of the seas, particularly the Red Sea region. So Aksum, of course, had established by 2nd century well-established trade links with other empires. Other empires knew about the Aksumite king. And the peak of the Axumite power really came in
Mhm.
the 6th century. By that time, the Axumite Empire had established a large navy capable of not just trading with other powers, but also protecting its ships and protecting its coasts. There was, by this point, as many of your viewers will know, Axum had established itself as a Christian civilization. The leader at the time was my own namesake, King Caleb. King Caleb actually launched a large show of force, a naval force with 100 and alleged 120,000 men, according to historical records. And he sailed these 120,000 men across the Red Sea in a show of might and in a show of how intertwined the Axumites were to that Red Sea region. And he entered Yemen, deposed King Yusuf of Himyar, and installed sort of a governor that would be accountable to the Axumite region. And having established this new order, sailed back to the Axumite shores. And it is said that Caleb retreated into monastic life after this. Bear in mind, this is the peak of the Axumite era. This is sort of the Ethiopian civilization at its height, not only being cited as one of the four great kingdoms of that era, not only able to establish trade in what are then considered luxury goods with other empires, but also able to show force, show a willingness to engage in military campaigns across the seas. That was the zenith, the peak of the Axumite Empire.
In this regard, the heydays of Ethiopia civilization at that time, we can take the coins of Ezana, where Ethiopian transcend the modes of barter trading system. The peak of Ethiopia civilization during the Axumite dynasty, Axumite Empire, and when King Caleb came to the throne as well. But eventually, due to internal and external dynamism, that heyday became contested and challenged. How do you see?
The Axumite Empire's foreign engagements and its sort of unique African state building project were intertwined. Okay, trade with other civilizations meant that the Axumites were able to develop currency, coins, which is very rare in the times of antiquity. In fact, the reason that we know for sure that the Axumites converted to Christianity as an empire, making Ethiopia sort of the second Christian empire in the world after Armenia. The reason we know that is because of some of the coins. A lot of the coins from that era that archaeologists have found, especially under King Izana, there
Mhm.
was a sudden shift from coins that depicted sort of the sun god that the
Okay.
pagan rulers used to worship prior to the empire's conversion to Christianity. And all of a sudden, after Izana in the 3rd century converts to Christianity, you start to see the coins with a cross, okay, a very clear
Mhm.
sign, and even references to the Creator and to God. And so you see that continuity. So it's not just that we know that the Axumites traded these different relics, the architecture during the time show us the peak, the content of the civilization within the Aksum itself. Now, to your question as to what happened to Aksum, what happened to this Ethiopian empire, a couple of things. The first, uh, after Caleb conquered Himyar and established a vassal, okay, the international system also started to change, and you saw the emergence of two new powers in the international arena in the 6th and 7th centuries. The first, okay, was the rise of the Persian Empire. Eventually, by the end of the 6th century, the Persians were able to establish themselves on the eastern coast of the Red Sea, and they were able to push back against Axumite influence. So losing that dominance over the eastern coast of the Red Sea, right, Himyar, dealt a blow to the prestige of the Axumite Empire. And then along with that, of course, the 7th century brought with it the first grand Arab empire, the Umayyad Caliphate, which sort of stretched itself across the seas into North Africa eventually, and established the zenith of the Arab civilization, or the beginning of the Arab civilization. Okay, so the emergence of new powers, new ideologies, sort of shifts the international balance of power and dominance of the Red Sea region away from Aksum. Aksum during this time loses its control over the Red Sea, but what that also means is that it loses its control of trade routes. And loss of the control of trade routes means that the empire's prosperity is now declining at a very alarming phase. And then internally, more of your viewers will know that Aksum faced a lot of internal rebellion. The final blow to the Aksumite Empire by attacking its capital, and the Aksumites would basically shelter themselves away, their empire decimated, and would be succeeded by the Zagwe dynasty during that period. So a mix of internal factors, but also very importantly, external factors, and more specifically, the Red Sea here had a definitive role in terms of determining the survival, or in this case, the decline of the Aksumite civilization.
In the contemporary sense, Ethiopia became a landlocked very recently, which is a national trauma, which needs also an exit strategy based on win-win approach. How do you see the civilizational relationship between Ethiopia's being ancient country with direct access to sea outlets and the current situation?
There's a perception, I think, that the idea of Ethiopia as a landlocked country is normal in the grand state of affairs, and my perception is that the 27-year period or so under which Ethiopia sort of became a landlocked state is an aberration, meaning it's deviant from the large-scale history of the region. So, a lot of not just Ethiopian manuscripts, but also international diplomatic communiques attest to the fact that there was an understanding of the importance of Ethiopia functioning as a Red Sea state. For instance, in the 1990s, there was a communique launched by the United Nations investigating the transition into the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF. And one of the things the United Nations document attested to was that Ethiopia had a history of being a proud sovereign nation because it had access to the sea. Okay, the sovereign, so it wasn't necessarily a question of power or dominance leading up to the modern era. It was a question of sovereignty. And we can go into what sovereignty means in this context. We could look at the Italian colonial conquest as well, and its roots. Okay, I'll start with the historical record. In 1917, Italy accepted that the port of Assab was useless unless Ethiopia used it. And so they offered thousands of acres of land in Assab to the Ethiopian government during the time for free on a 100-year lease, because they understood that Ethiopia using that port would bring prosperity, not just Ethiopia, but to the Italian colony of Eritrea during that time. So I think in this respect, okay, a lot of diplomatic records attest to the fact that Ethiopia having access to the sea brings prosperity to the region, to everyone involved. And this is the grand scale of history outside of the 27 years of deviant history. So the question becomes then, how and why did Ethiopia lose access to the sea. And we tend to fixate on the Eritrea question here. I don't think it's about Eritrea at all. I don't think you can divorce colonialism from
exactly.
Ethiopia's loss of access to the seas. We said that the Axumite Empire's access to the Red Sea waned after the rise of the Persian Empire, after the rise of the Umayyad Caliphate, the Arab Empire across the Middle East and North Africa. And other empires, other dynasties would take over during different parts of history. So the Fatimids would dominate the Red Sea in the 10th century by virtue of control over Egypt. And Egypt starts to play a major role on the Red Sea after that as well. Fast forward to the 19th century, the Ottomans, again, via their control of Egypt, meaning installing an Ottoman viceroy to lead Egypt, would be able to control the Red Seas. In fact, one of the reasons the Ottomans gained a strong naval presence was that their control of the Red Seas allowed them to keep Portugal outside of the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea region as a whole. And Portugal at the time was the other major naval power by the 19th century. And then there's another event that makes the Red Sea that much more important. Okay, remember, by this point, the Red Sea is not just an outlet for transport of commercial goods and naval power projection. It is also an outlet for religious pilgrimage because it provides the main access towards the holy cities for Muslims of Mecca and Medina. So what happens by the 19th century? By the 19th century, the Ethiopian Empire is sort of reconsolidating itself and entering what we refer to as the pre-modern era. And at the same time, Khedive Ismail Pasha, who's this really sort of a visionary, ambitious ruler of Egypt, and what he wants to do is he wants to create a large Egyptian empire in Northeast Africa.
Right,
Right. And there's one power that is standing in his way, because if he wants a large, expansive Egyptian empire backed by the Ottoman Turks, he needs to get rid of the Ethiopian king. And so Khedive Ismail Pasha launches a large-scale invasion in 1875.
At the Battle of Gundat and Nagura, exactly.
Exactly. So he launches, he uses the port of Mis'uwa in modern-day Eritrea to launch that invasion. And unexpectedly for him is repelled by the forces of King Johannes IV. And after that, there is a reigniting of a desire for Ethiopia to access the sea outlet, to escape the sense of isolation from the rest of the world and modernize the empire by establishing access to the sea. But what happens here? What happens here is that the Italian colonial project brings an end to Ethiopia's desire to reestablish its access to the sea. So an Italian company in 1869, Rubattino Enterprises, had purchased the port of Assab from the Afar tribal leaders in the Danakil Depression during that time. By 1882, the Italians purchase the port of Assab from Rubattino because Rubattino basically goes bankrupt, and the company goes bankrupt. And by 1885, the Italians themselves arrive in Mis'uwa and establish the Grand Italian East Africa Project by colonizing Eritrea. So that sort of begins the trajectory of continuing to isolate Ethiopia from Red Sea access in the modern era. And we see that playing out not just in the 19th, but all through the 20th century. So although Ethiopia decisively defeated the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, as you know, it wasn't able to regain its access to the sea. The Italians were able to maintain their hold over Eritrea during that time.
Yeah.
And during the years of Italian control, Eritrea comes to form its own distinct political identity. So although Eritrea is federated in the 1950s with Ethiopia, and Ethiopia regains its access to the sea through the Eritrean Federation, the vestiges, the legacies of colonial contestation continue. And in the modern era, the Red Sea also becomes an arena for great power politics. So very similar to what we see today. And remember, by this point, the Red Sea is not just connecting Africa to Asia and the Middle East, but also to Europe. Because by the end of the 19th century, a French company had built the Suez Canal in Egypt, opening up a passageway from Asia through the Horn of Africa, through the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, to Europe. Okay, that is why today 15% of commercial goods that travel across the globe travel across the Red Sea. Okay, that number might be a little less now because of the attacks from the Houthis in Yemen. But historically, recently, the number has been as high as 15%. So it's a major trade route, and that's all because of the Suez Canal. What's interesting is that to fund his military adventures, Khedive Ismail Pasha borrowed so much money that in 1875, he had to give up 44% ownership stake in the Suez Canal to Britain. And Britain, okay, went from 44% ownership to majority ownership over time. So we see the Italians making their inroads through Eritrea. We see Great Britain making its inroads through Egypt. Okay, so the colonial interests in the region and in the Red Sea continue. And of course, the Red Sea becomes very important during the first and second, especially during the Second World War. After Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia had the third largest coastline on the sea. Okay, they did not like it because it prevented them from being confident about staging a total blockade, meaning stopping commercial ships from passing into Israel during their war with Israel in 1973, the Yom Kippur War. Okay, so strategically, it became very hard to unite the Red Sea countries in a blockade against Israel if there was this one power that wasn't really considered an Arab power during that time. As many of your viewers will know, the foreign policy imperative of many of these Middle Eastern countries became basically, how do we strip Ethiopia of its Red Sea outlet? Part of that, it was not the only thing they did, but part of that strategy was providing large amounts of diplomatic support in the case of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and in the case of countries like Libya and Iraq, financial support to separatists in what was the Eritrean province during that time. And of course, Ethiopia's dissolution of the federal structure between Eritrea and Ethiopia reanimated these rebellions as well. So a confluence of all these factors meant that, and even before, okay, the referendum signed away access to Asab and Mis'uwa in 1993, already there was an ideological consensus, okay, and an ideological consensus among first the European colonial powers and then the strong Arab powers of the time, that it was very inconvenient for strategic reasons to have a strong sovereign Ethiopian state with a presence in the Red Sea. Okay, so to me, what matters is not so much the independence of Eritrea in 1993 or the loss of access, because we know that until the 1999 war, actually, there were periods in which Eritrea offered the port of Asab to Ethiopia to use for free. But what really mattered here, I think, was the ideological consensus that Ethiopia being stripped of its outlet to the Red Sea would provide a strategic gain to Arabize, quote unquote, the Red Sea, and have it be the exclusive domain of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and of course, all the other European colonial powers former colonial powers who established bases along the Red Sea coast. Okay, in the 1890s, France established a coast in French Somaliland. Nowadays, we call it Djibouti. And of course, in the 2000s, we see a lot of the great powers, China, the United States, establishing bases in the Red Sea as well. So it's the strategic area, everybody cares about it, but it becomes ideologically convenient to pressure Ethiopia to recede from that region for strategic reasons.
Distancing and detaching Ethiopia from its historical and civilizational connection with the access to the sea outlet. How do you see the heralded news on the 1st of January 2024 disclosed by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed or the federal government of Ethiopia signing MOU, though Ethiopia has historical, civilizational, psychological, geographical, and also strategical relations with sea outlet?
I'd like to start with the question of why. Why would Ethiopia articulate a desire to return to the seas? Because when you're talking about a state that has 130 million people and without access to the sea, and with 90 to 95% of commercial goods, some with national security significance, being shipped through just one outlet in Djibouti, with very exorbitant shipping costs, not to mention port access fees, then you have to wonder whether this is really about power or domination, or whether this is simply about an ability to survive, maintain stability, develop, and affirm a nation's national sovereignty. So my perception, and this is not unique to Ethiopia, I think this is how states try to conduct foreign policy in the modern era. Developing countries want to modernize and survive. If you think about the list of countries that have no access to the sea, okay, the second largest by population doesn't even have half of Ethiopia's population. Okay, Uganda is landlocked, but its population isn't even 50 million. Ethiopia's population is 130 million. So it is hard for me to separate these existential and survivalist needs of a state from a desire to have a reliable, consistent access to the sea.
To sea outlet.
And there's a age-old saying, okay, we have now a Red Sea Council dominated by all the countries along the Red Sea coast on both sides. Obviously, Ethiopia is excluded, so are other relevant stakeholders like the United Arab Emirates. And there's a saying that if you're not at the negotiating table, or if you're not at the dinner table, you just might be on the menu. And so I think, again, the question here is a question of sovereignty and whether the access to the sea comes via Somaliland or whether another agreement is negotiated to the benefit of all parties. I don't think that Ethiopia having sea access is a threat to the Horn of Africa. I think it might bring up opportunities for greater levels of economic integration, trade, and prosperity.
How could Ethiopia can manage, and what sort of strategies should the government and the entire population of Ethiopia should follow to talk the talk in a very effective and fruitful manner, where Ethiopia has a legitimate question, and it is also a generational issue, not only for today, but also for the upcoming generations of Ethiopians?
You can look at the alternative. You can pose the alternative to the international community and say, look, what if Ethiopia doesn't have access to the sea for the next 50 years? Okay, a nation of 130 million people, second largest country in Africa by population, stripped of access to the sea, unable to rely on a consistent, reliable shipping port to send off its goods and also import basic goods for its survival. How does that country survive? What kinds of conflicts may be brewed because of a lack of access to this strategic development? There's a quote from diamond that basically says what landlockedness is it's a tax on development, a permanent structural tax on development. Now, I'm here in the United States, and you can look at how nervous countries around the world are because their imports or their exports to the United States are now being taxed at 10%. Well, if you're that nervous about the survival of your country over a 10% tariff, think about what kind of tax it means to have to pay exorbitant shipping fees for a country of 130 million people. Okay, it's a permanent tax that lags Ethiopia's development. It's a structural constraint. And so the way that I think strategically the government and the society can communicate the need for sea access is, even if you take aside questions of civilizational continuity, there is a question of state survival and sovereignty in an international system that is increasingly interconnected, global, and okay, that's the challenge. But there's also this great opportunity of what would it look like if Ethiopia had access to the sea, if it was a stakeholder, a responsible stakeholder, along with its neighbors. What kinds of opportunities for prosperity and economic development could arise in the country and in the region as a whole? I think this is the incentive that could be communicated to the international community to articulate that there isn't necessarily a threat arising from Ethiopia's return to the Red Sea.
A holistic incentive, as you have said. Dr. Caleb Demerew, Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Relations at Texas A&M University in the United States. Thank you very much, really much appreciate for your time. Thank you so much, and for your critical analysis, where Ethiopia's access to sea outlets trajectory from ancient antiquity to the contemporary, as well as for the future as well. Thank you very much once again, Dr. Khalid.
My pleasure, Gazacho. Thank you for having me.
Dear viewers and listeners, by this we come to the end of today's show. You can follow us on different platforms of EBC's social media, YouTube, Facebook, and other social media platforms. Thank you for you being with us until we meet with another edition of Addis Dialogue. Goodbye for now.